My dad locked my sister in her room for disrespecting the badge, then forced her to serve dinner to the cop who touched me. When I told him what Vance did, he brushed it off, calling me dramatic. But 4 months later I found him sitting alone in the dark, crying into my sister's notebook as Mom silently brought him tissues. Imagine being a kid, seeing your own father turn against your older sister, punishing her for speaking an uncomfortable truth. But what I didn't know was that truth would come back to haunt us all, and nearly destroy our family from the inside out. It all started when my older sister, Raven, dropped a bombshell. She accused our dad's police department of looking the other way, of covering for her best friend Celeste's stepdad, Officer Vance, after he brutally hit Celeste and her mom. Within days, our family practically hated Raven. The house turned into a war zone. "Shut your mouth, little girl. And you teenagers think you know everything," became the only words spoken to her. From that moment, Dad, the man who just a week ago loved Raven fiercely, led the charge to make her life a living hell. He'd personally insist she eat dinners alone until she apologized. He'd lock her in her room during family activities, saying she needed to learn to behave. He even invited his cop friends over, forcing Raven to cook for them, just so she'd learn to respect the badge. I was only 11 and honestly, I just couldn't grasp why everyone had suddenly turned on my big sister. She was so bright, so kind, and she always spoke her mind, always spoke the truth. So when our parents sent her to bed without dinner, which was almost every night, I started sneaking food up to her room. She'd give me this sad, knowing smile, ruffle my hair, and just accept it. One night, I followed her when she snuck out around midnight. My heart was pounding. I was absolutely heartbroken, convinced she was running away, leaving me behind. But instead, I found her going to Celeste's house. I peered through the window and saw her, gently, carefully cleaning cuts on Celeste's mom's face. When she spotted me hiding, she just put a finger to her lips and mouthed, "Don't tell Dad." At first, I felt like the coolest kid ever, holding such a huge secret. But then, something dark started to happen. Officer Vance, Celeste's stepdad, started showing up everywhere I went. The first time was at the corner store, where I bought candy after school. He just appeared out of nowhere and insisted on paying for my Skittles. He said something about taking care of his buddy's little girl. It felt off. The next week, he was waiting outside my school. He told me Dad asked him to walk me home for safety, which was ridiculous. I'd been walking home alone since 3rd grade, and we lived literally 5 minutes away. The whole walk, he kept his hand on my shoulder, asking if any boys at school had caught my eye. I just wanted to shrink into the pavement. The third time, it happened at our family barbecue. I was grabbing juice from the garage fridge when he cornered me. He started stroking my hair, telling me how much I looked like Raven when she was younger. Then he kissed my forehead. But it wasn't like Dad's kisses. His lips stayed there too long, and his hand was on the back of my neck, holding me in place. I felt frozen, disgusted. I bolted straight to Dad, who was flipping burgers. I told him exactly what happened, trying not to cry, but the words tumbled out with my fear. He didn't even look up from the grill. Just said, "Vance is friendly like that. Stop being dramatic, Ma. Go help your mother." I felt like I was going crazy. Was I imagining it? I started avoiding the garage and the corner store, taking the longest way home from school. But Vance found me anyway. The following week, I was on the swings at the park when he sat on the one next to me. He started talking about how I was becoming such a pretty young lady. Then he put his hand on my lower back and said, "Dad was lucky to have such beautiful daughters." That's when Raven appeared. She came out of nowhere, running full speed. She shoved him so hard he almost fell off the swing. He started screaming something, but she grabbed my hand and we just ran for our lives. Her breathing was ragged, her face red with pure, unadulterated anger. We burst through Dad's office door. "Your disgusting pervert friend is touching Ma," Raven yelled. Dad's face went from surprise to stone cold in seconds. He stood up slowly, and for a second, just a tiny one, I thought he'd believe us. But instead, he said, "Vance is a good man. He'd never. You're both lying for attention, just like before." "Just like before?" I asked, confused. No one answered. Dad then turned to Raven, his voice dripping with venom, saying that given her hatred of the badge, it made sense she sees problems that aren't there. That night, we had an emergency family meeting. Mom made us sit at the dining table with Vance right across from us. His police uniform was perfectly pressed, and he had this small, smug smile that made my stomach churn. "Assaulting an officer," he said slowly. "Those are serious charges." He stood up and circled Raven, like a predator. "You're turning 18 soon," Dad added, his voice cold. "That's up to 5 years in prison." Vance chimed in with this disgusting tone. "Mika will be 16 by the time you get out." Then Mom spoke up, her voice tight. "But we can make it all go away. Just apologize for what you said about Vance." And he promised us not to press charges. Raven tried to argue that she was protecting me, but they wouldn't listen. I was so terrified, I just mumbled sorry, while staring at my lap, wanting to disappear. They demanded Raven apologize. She looked Dad straight in the eye and said something about, "Not again," and, "Isn't it obvious now?" Dad's whole body went rigid. Ancient history. Apologize now. It was only when Vance started putting Raven in cuffs that she finally, reluctantly, apologized. Vance laughed. "Our parents sent us upstairs." Raven held my hand the whole way, her grip a lifeline. Later that week, Vance walked me home from school again. While holding my hand, he leaned in and whispered in my ear that Celeste's mom was going to pay for what my sister had said about him. That very same night, Celeste called Raven sobbing. Her mom was in the hospital with a broken jaw. That was the moment Raven broke. When our parents were asleep, she came into my room, absolutely sobbing. It was the first time she didn't look like a superhero to me. She looked like a sister needing help. I held her in my arms, and through her tears, she told me she needed to tell me something. She made me pinky promise I wouldn't spill, then revealed this wasn't the first time Vance had done this. My face went white. I asked her what she meant. She said when she was 14, Vance had cornered her at a police picnic. He'd hurt her behind a bush. She ran to Dad, skirt torn, his skin under her fingernails from clawing at him, but Dad called her a liar. Said Vance was part of the badge, had a 10-year-old daughter himself, so he would never do that. Dad forced Raven to apologize to Vance then too. She broke down even harder, ugly, crying into my shoulder, the weight of years of silence crushing her. I sat there, frozen, Raven's tears soaking through my pajama top. My mind raced, trying to process what she just told me. Officer Vance had hurt her when she was only a few years older than I was now. The same man who kept finding me everywhere, who touched my hair and held me too close. The same man Dad defended like he was family. Raven pulled back, wiping her face with her sleeve. Her eyes were puffy and red, but there was something else there too. A fierce determination. She grabbed my shoulders and made me look at her. She told me we needed to be smart about this, that Dad would never believe us, and Mom would just go along with whatever Dad said. She explained how Vance knew exactly what he was doing, how he'd been doing it for years. First to her, now to me, and who knew how many others. The next morning at breakfast, everything felt different. Dad read his newspaper like normal. Mom scrambled eggs like normal. But nothing was normal anymore. I kept glancing at Raven, who just pushed food around her plate without eating. When Dad left for work, he ruffled my hair like always, but I flinched. He didn't even notice. At school, I couldn't concentrate. My teacher asked if I was feeling okay, and I just nodded. During recess, I hid in the library instead of playing with my friends. The librarian let me help her sort books, which kept my hands busy while my mind wouldn't stop spinning. When the final bell rang, my stomach dropped. I took the longest route possible, cutting through the park, doubling back twice. But when I finally turned onto our street, there he was, Officer Vance, leaning against his patrol car right in front of our house. He smiled when he saw me and pushed off the car. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like jelly. He walked over slowly, taking his time, like he knew I had nowhere to go. When he reached me, he put his hand on my shoulder and steered me toward the house. Inside, Mom was in the kitchen making dinner. She smiled at Vance and thanked him for walking me home safely. He squeezed my shoulder harder and said it was his pleasure, that he'd do anything for his partner's family. Mom beamed like he'd just given her a compliment. Vance stayed for dinner. Dad invited him, of course. They laughed about some arrests they'd made last week while Mom served pot roast. Raven came down when Dad yelled for her. She took one look at Vance, sitting in her usual spot, and her whole body went rigid. Dad noticed, and his face darkened. He pointed to the chair right next to Vance and told her to sit. Raven's hands shook as she pulled out the chair. Vance smiled at her like they were old friends. Throughout dinner, he kept accidentally brushing against her arm when he reached for things. It was sickening. After dinner, Dad and Vance went to the garage to look at Dad's new power tools. Mom started clearing plates and told us girls to help. In the kitchen, Raven dropped a glass, and it shattered on the floor. Mom sighed and told her to be more careful. While we cleaned up the glass, we heard laughter from the garage. Male voices carrying through the walls. Raven's jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. When we finished, Mom sent us upstairs to do homework. In the hallway, Raven pulled me into her room instead of letting me go to mine. She locked the door and turned on music. Then she went to her closet and pulled out a shoebox from the back corner. Inside were things I didn't expect. A small digital recorder, a disposable camera, a notebook filled with dates and times. She explained she'd been documenting everything since that day at the park. Every time Vance showed up at my school, every weird comment, every too long touch. She'd even taken pictures of his patrol car parked outside places I went. The notebook had it all, written down in her neat handwriting. But she said it wasn't enough. Dad would just say Vance was being protective, that we were reading into innocent behavior. She needed something more concrete. Her eyes met mine, and I knew what she was thinking before she said it. The next day after school, I didn't take any detours. I walked straight to the corner store where I always bought candy. Just like Raven predicted, Vance showed up within minutes. He came up behind me while I was looking at the candy display and put both hands on my shoulders. He leaned down close to my ear and asked what looked good today. His breath smelled like coffee and cigarettes. I pointed at the Skittles with a shaky finger. He reached over me to grab them, pressing against my back longer than necessary. At the register, he paid like always and handed me the candy. Outside the store, he suggested we take the scenic route home. Through the park, he said. More trees, prettier walk. I nodded because what else could I do? As we walked, he kept his hand on my lower back, occasionally sliding it down further before moving it back up. In the park, he steered me toward a bench surrounded by bushes, the same area where the playground used to be before they tore it down. He sat and patted the spot next to him. I sat on the very edge, ready to run. He scooted closer until our legs touched. That's when Raven appeared from behind the bushes with the disposable camera. The flash went off 3 times before Vance even realized what was happening. He jumped up, his face turning red, then purple. He lunged for the camera, but Raven was already running. I ran too, in the opposite direction just like we'd planned. I heard Vance yelling behind us but didn't look back. My feet pounded the pavement and my chest burned, but I kept running. I burst through our front door and ran straight to Mom, who was folding laundry in the living room. I collapsed against her, gasping for air. She held me and asked what was wrong. Before I could answer, Raven flew through the door and slammed it behind her. She was breathing hard too, but she had this wild look in her eyes, like she'd won something. Mom demanded to know what was going on. That's when Dad's car pulled into the driveway. Then another patrol car. Then another. Within minutes, our living room was full of uniforms. Vance pushed through them all, pointing at Raven and yelling about assault and harassment. Dad's face was stone as he looked between us. Vance told his version first. How he was just walking me home safely when Raven attacked him. How she'd been stalking him for weeks, taking pictures and making up lies. How she was trying to destroy his reputation because he caught her friend Celeste shoplifting months ago. Dad turned to Raven and asked for the camera. She shook her head. He asked again, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet tone. Still she refused. He stepped forward, and I thought he might grab her, but Mom put her hand on his arm. The other officers started murmuring about pressing charges, about how Raven was almost 18, about how this was clearly harassment of a fellow officer. Vance nodded along, playing the victim perfectly. He even managed to look hurt, like Raven had deeply wounded him. That's when I found my voice. I told them about the corner store, the walks home, the park bench, the way he touched me, how he said things about my body, how he compared me to Raven when she was younger. The words tumbled out faster and faster until I was almost screaming. The room went silent. Dad's face cycled through emotions I couldn't name. The other officers shifted uncomfortably. Vance's mask slipped for just a second, and I saw something dark lash across his face. Then he schooled his expression back to wounded innocence. He shook his head sadly and said I was clearly confused, that Raven had filled my head with lies, that I was just a kid who didn't understand that friendly behavior wasn't inappropriate. He turned to Dad and said he was sorry his daughters had turned out this way. Dad's jaw tightened. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in weeks. Then his gaze shifted to Raven, who stood defiant, chin raised, the camera clutched tight in her hands. The other officers waited for Dad to say something, to pick a side. Finally, Dad spoke. He said this was clearly a family matter that had gotten out of hand, that emotions were running high, that everyone needed to cool down. He suggested the other officers leave, so we could sort this out privately. They hesitated, but Dad used his sergeant voice, and they filed out one by one. Vance was the last to go. He paused at the door and looked back at us, at me specifically. His eyes promised this wasn't over, that there would be consequences. Then he smiled at Dad, all friendly again, and said he'd see him at work tomorrow. When the door closed, Dad turned on us. But before he could speak, Raven held up the camera and said she had proof, that the pictures would show exactly what kind of man Vance really was. Dad demanded she hand it over. She took a step back toward the stairs. Mom finally spoke up. She said, maybe we should all sit down and talk about this calmly. That clearly something had happened to upset us girls. That we were family and could work through anything. But her voice wavered like she wasn't sure she believed her own words. We sat around the dining room table, the same table where Vance had threatened Raven with jail time, where he'd circled her like prey. Mom made tea that nobody drank. Dad drummed his fingers on the wood, a habit that meant he was thinking hard. Raven went first. She told them everything, starting with the police picnic when she was 14. How Vance had cornered her behind the storage shed. How he'd put his hand over her mouth. How she'd fought and scratched but he was too strong. How he'd whispered that nobody would believe her. Dad's drumming stopped. His face went pale then flushed red. Mom covered her mouth with her hand. I reached for Raven's hand under the table and squeezed. She squeezed back and kept talking about how she'd run to Dad with grass stains and tears. How he'd called her a liar. She talked about the months after. How Vance would smirk at her at family gatherings. How he'd make little comments when nobody else was listening. How she tried to never be alone, but sometimes it was impossible. How she'd been terrified when she saw him starting the same pattern with me. When she finished, the room was thick with silence. Mom was crying quietly. Dad stared at the table like it held answers. I wanted to say something but my throat felt closed up. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking seconds that felt like hours. Dad finally lifted his head from the table. His hands trembled as he reached for his coffee mug, then pulled back without touching it. Mom wiped her eyes with a tissue and looked between Raven and me. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, each note hanging heavy in the air. Dad stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He paced to the window, then back to the table. His face had gone from red to an ashy gray. He opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. Mom reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Raven stayed perfectly still, her spine straight, her eyes fixed on Dad. I could feel her hand still gripping mine under the table. Her palm was sweaty, but her grip was steady. She'd said what needed saying and now we waited. Dad finally spoke, his voice hoarse. He asked Raven why she never told him the truth about the picnic, why she let him think she was lying all these years. His words came out broken, like each one hurt to say. Raven's grip on my hand tightened. She explained that she had told him, that she'd run to him crying with dirt on her clothes and Vance's skin under her nails, that she'd begged him to believe her, but he'd chosen his partner over his daughter. He'd made her apologize to the man who hurt her. Dad's whole body seemed to deflate. He sank back into his chair and put his head in his hands. Mom moved closer to him, but he shook her off. The silence stretched on until I thought I might scream just to break it. Then Dad's phone rang. The sharp sound made us all jump. He looked at the screen, and his face went even paler. It was Vance. Dad let it ring until it went to voicemail. A moment later, a text came through. Then another, and another. Dad read them silently, his jaw working. Whatever Vance was saying, it wasn't good. Dad set the phone face down on the table and looked at Raven. Really looked at her. Maybe for the first time in years. His eyes were wet. He asked to see the camera. Raven hesitated, then slid it across the table. Dad picked it up carefully, like it might explode. He turned it over in his hands, studying it from every angle. Then he set it down gently and pushed it back to Raven. He told her to keep it safe, that he needed time to think, to figure out what to do. Raven nodded and tucked the camera into her pocket. Dad's phone buzzed again. This time he turned it off completely. Mom suggested we all get some sleep, that things would be clearer in the morning, but nobody moved. We sat there in the dining room. For people who lived in the same house, but suddenly felt like strangers. The tea Mom had made earlier sat cold and untouched. Eventually, exhaustion won. Dad went to his study and closed the door. Mom drifted to their bedroom. Raven and I climbed the stairs together, still holding hands. At the top, she pulled me into another hug and whispered that everything would be okay. I wanted to believe her. In my room, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Every car that passed made me tense, wondering if it was Vance's patrol car. Every creak of the house made my heart race. Sleep felt impossible, but somehow I must have drifted off because suddenly sunlight was streaming through my curtains. The house was quiet when I went downstairs. Too quiet. Mom sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, staring at nothing. She startled when she saw me, then forced a smile and asked if I wanted breakfast. I shook my head and poured myself orange juice instead. Dad's study door was still closed. His car was gone from the driveway. Mom said he'd left early for work, that he had things to take care of. She didn't meet my eyes when she said it. I wondered what kind of things needed taking care of at 6 o'clock in the morning. Raven came down looking like she hadn't slept at all. Dark circles shadowed her eyes and her hair was tangled. She poured coffee and sat next to me, her shoulder touching mine. Mom watched us but didn't say anything. The three of us sat in silence as the morning stretched on. Around 10, Dad's car pulled back into the driveway. He came in through the back door moving slowly, like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His uniform was wrinkled and his badge was crooked. He looked at each of us in turn, then asked Raven and me to come to his study. Inside, he closed the door and leaned against it. The room smelled like coffee and old leather from his chair. Pictures of our family covered one wall. Happier times when we all still smiled in photos. Dad's eyes lingered on one of him and Raven at her middle school graduation. He told us he'd been to see Vance, that they'd had a conversation. Vance had denied everything, of course, called Raven troubled, and said I was just confused. But Dad had seen something in his partner's eyes. A flicker of guilt, maybe, or fear. Dad explained that Vance had been his partner for 8 years. They'd saved each other's lives more than once. Trusted each other with everything. Or so Dad had thought. Now he didn't know what to believe. The evidence was circumstantial. The photos Raven took just showed Vance sitting next to me. But Dad couldn't ignore what we told him. Couldn't pretend anymore that Vance was just being friendly. Not after hearing about the picnic. Not after seeing the fear in my eyes. He'd failed Raven once. He wouldn't fail us again. The problem was proof. Without something concrete, it would be our word against Vance's. And Vance had friends in the department. Lots of them. If Dad went after him without solid evidence, it could destroy Dad's career. Maybe even put our family in danger. Raven pulled out her notebook and showed Dad all the dates and times she documented. Every instance of Vance showing up where I was. Every inappropriate comment or touch. Dad studied it carefully, his face growing darker with each page. When he finished reading, Dad set the notebook down and rubbed his eyes. He looked exhausted, defeated. He admitted he didn't know what to do, how to protect us without destroying everything he'd built. His career, his reputation, his friendships. That's when Mom knocked and came in without waiting for an answer. Her face was pale and she clutched her phone. She said Celeste's mom was in the hospital again. this time with a broken arm and cracked ribs. The doctors were asking questions about how it happened. Dad's head snapped up. He asked for details, but Mom didn't have many, just that a neighbor had called an ambulance after hearing screaming from the house, that Celeste was with her mom at the hospital, that Vance was nowhere to be found. Something shifted in Dad's face, a decision being made. He stood up and straightened his uniform, fixed his badge. He told Mom to pack bags for us, that we were going to stay with her sister for a few days. Mom started to protest, but Dad cut her off with a look. He turned to Raven and asked for the camera again. This time, she handed it over without hesitation. He pocketed it along with her notebook. Then he hugged us both, holding on longer than usual. When he pulled back, his eyes were hard with determination. After Dad left, Mom rushed around packing suitcases. She wouldn't tell us what was happening, just that Dad said we needed to go. Now Raven and I exchanged worried looks, but helped gather our things. Within an hour, we were loaded in Mom's car, heading to Aunt Margaret's house 2 towns over. The drive felt endless. Mom gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles were white. She kept checking the rearview mirror like someone might be following us. Raven sat in the back with me, her arm around my shoulders. Nobody spoke. Aunt Margaret met us at the door, her face creased with concern. She ushered us inside and immediately started making tea, her default response to any crisis. Her house smelled like cinnamon and felt safe in a way our own home hadn't in weeks. We spent the rest of the day waiting. Mom paced. Aunt Margaret cooked enough food for an army. Raven and I sat on the couch, flipping through TV channels without really watching anything. Every time a phone rang, we all jumped. It was almost midnight when Dad finally called. Mom took the phone into the other room, but we could hear her gasps and occasional questions. When she came back, her face was unreadable. She said Dad was okay, but wouldn't be home tonight. Maybe not for a few days. The next morning, Aunt Margaret made pancakes and tried to pretend everything was normal, but the TV was on in the background, and we all saw when the local news mentioned an officer being suspended pending investigation. They didn't name names, but Mom's sharp intake of breath told us everything. Raven grabbed my hand under the table. I squeezed back, remembering all the times she'd protected me, all the times she'd stood up for truth, even when it cost her everything. Now Dad was doing the same thing. We stayed at Aunt Margaret's for 3 days. 3 days of waiting and worrying and checking phones constantly. Mom barely slept. She'd drift around the house at all hours, making tea she didn't drink and straightening things that didn't need straightening. On the 3rd night, Dad showed up at the door. He looked haggard, but there was something different about him. A lightness, maybe, like a weight had been lifted. He hugged Mom first, then came to where Raven and I sat on the couch. He told us it was over, that Vance had been arrested. Not just suspended, but actually arrested. The camera photos combined with Celeste's mom's injuries had been enough to start a real investigation. And once they started looking, they found more. So much more. Other girls had come forward. Girls from the neighborhood. Girls whose parents had dismissed their complaints. Girls who'd been told they were being dramatic or misunderstanding friendly behavior. The investigation was expanding. Vance wouldn't be hurting anyone else. Dad's voice broke when he apologized to Raven for not believing her, for choosing his partner over his daughter, for making her apologize to her attacker. He said he'd never forgive himself for failing her when she needed him most. Raven stood up and hugged him. Really hugged him, not the stiff, obligatory embraces of recent years. I saw Dad's shoulders shake as he held her. Mom joined them, then pulled me in too. We stood there in Aunt Margaret's living room, holding each other and crying. We went home the next day. The house felt different somehow, lighter, safer. Dad had taken time off work to be with us. He said there would be interviews and statements to give, court dates eventually, but we'd face it all together. That first night home, we actually ate dinner as a family. All 4 of us at the table, talking and even laughing a little. Dad had made Raven's favorite lasagna. Mom opened windows to let fresh air in. It felt like our house was breathing again after holding its breath for so long. Celeste came over the next day. Her mom was still in the hospital but stable. They were staying with Celeste's grandmother now. She and Raven hugged for a long time, both of them crying. I heard Celeste whisper, "Thank you," over and over. The investigation continued for weeks. Dad had to testify about what he knew and when. Other officers were questioned about what they might have seen or ignored. The department was in turmoil, but Dad said that was okay. That sometimes things needed to be torn down to be rebuilt better. Raven started seeing a counselor, someone who specialized in helping survivors. Dad drove her to every appointment and waited in the parking lot. Sometimes she came out with red eyes, but she always seemed a little stronger, a little more like her old self. I had nightmares sometimes, dreams where Vance was following me and I couldn't run fast enough, where I screamed, but no sound came out. Mom would find me tangled in sweat-soaked sheets and hold me until the shaking stopped. She'd whisper that I was safe now, that he couldn't hurt me anymore. School felt weird at first. Some kids had heard rumors and whispered when I passed, but my teacher was extra kind, and my friends stuck close. One girl even told me privately that something similar had happened to her cousin, that she was glad someone finally stopped him. Dad struggled with the aftermath at work. Some officers supported him, others felt he'd betrayed the brotherhood. He'd come home some days looking defeated, but then he'd see us and his face would clear. He'd say we were worth any price. Vance's trial date was set for 6 months out. The prosecutor said they had a strong case. Multiple victims, evidence of a pattern, Dad's testimony about Vance's behavior, the photos Raven had taken. It would be hard, but justice was coming. Mom joined a support group for parents. She'd been carrying guilt about not protecting us, about being blind to what was happening. The group helped her process those feelings. She came home from meetings looking raw but determined to do better. Our family dinners became sacred. No matter what else was happening, we gathered at 6 o'clock. Sometimes we talked about heavy things. Sometimes we just discussed our days. But we showed up, all of us, together. Raven's 18th birthday approached. The birthday that might have been spent in jail if Vance had gotten his way. Instead, we planned a small party. Just family and a few close friends. Nothing fancy but full of love, full of recognition of what we'd survived. The night before her birthday, Raven came to my room. She sat on my bed like she used to when we were younger, before everything got complicated. She thanked me for believing her, for being brave enough to speak up, for not letting fear silence me. I told her she was the brave one, that she'd protected me even when it cost her everything. Even when our own parents turned against her. She'd never stopped fighting for truth. Never stopped being my big sister, my hero. We talked until late about everything and nothing. About how different things might have been. About how strong we'd become. About how sometimes the hardest battles are fought in your own home, with your own family, against people who should protect you. The next morning, Raven woke up 18 and free. Dad made her favorite breakfast. Mom decorated the kitchen with balloons. I gave her a photo album I'd made of all our good memories, the ones from before, but also new ones. Proof that we'd survived and were building something better. That afternoon, Celeste and her mom came by. Her mom's arm was still in a cast, but she was smiling, really smiling. She hugged Raven and thanked her for speaking up, for being brave enough to tell the truth when everyone wanted her to stay quiet. As I watched them talk, I thought about courage, how it sometimes looks like a 17-year-old girl standing up to adults, like a little sister sneaking food upstairs, like a father finally choosing his family over his career, like a mother admitting she'd failed and trying to do better. The doorbell rang, and Dad answered it. Some of his officer friends stood outside, the ones who'd supported him, who'd testified about things they'd noticed but ignored. They'd brought a cake and wanted to wish Raven happy birthday, to apologize for not seeing what was right in front of them. It was awkward at first. These men who'd watched Vance's behavior and done nothing, who'd laughed at his jokes and dismissed concerns. But they were here now trying to make amends. Dad let them in, and Raven graciously accepted their apologies. As the sun set on Raven's birthday, our house full of people who'd chosen truth over comfort, I felt something shift. We'd been broken, all of us in different ways, but we were healing together, stronger for having survived. There would still be hard days ahead. The trial, the testimony, the judgment of people who thought we should have stayed quiet, but we'd face it all together. A family that had almost been destroyed by silence and lies, rebuilt on a foundation of truth and love. That night, as I got ready for bed, I found a note on my pillow, Raven's handwriting. Thank you for being brave, little sister. Thank you for saving me too. Love always, R. I held it to my chest and cried. Good tears this time. Healing tears. The next few weeks brought a strange new rhythm to our house. Vance had been arrested, but his influence lingered like smoke in fabric. Dad went back to work after his suspension ended, walking out each morning with his shoulders squared, but his eyes wary. Some mornings, he'd pause at the door, hand on the knob, before forcing himself to step outside. At school, I noticed Officer Vance's patrol car was gone from its usual spots. No more surprise visits at the corner store. No more walks home. But I still took the long way. Still checked over my shoulder. Old habits formed from fear don't disappear overnight. Raven started spending more time with Celeste and her mom. They'd sit in our living room for hours, not really talking, just being together. Sometimes I'd bring them tea and see Celeste's mom absently rubbing her cast. The bruises on her face had faded to yellow-green shadows. One afternoon, Dad came home early and found them there. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, then walked over to Celeste's mom. He knelt down beside her chair and spoke quietly. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her shoulders start shaking. Dad stayed there, kneeling on our worn carpet while she cried. That weekend, Dad cleaned out his study. Box after box of police memorabilia disappeared into the garage. Photos from department picnics, awards, commendations. He kept only a few pictures, ones of just him in uniform, no other officers visible. Mom helped him rearrange the furniture, making the room look completely different. Raven's counseling appointments became a twice-weekly routine. Sometimes I'd go with Dad to pick her up, sitting in the car, doing homework while we waited. She'd come out looking drained, but somehow lighter. One day, she emerged with red-rimmed eyes, but a genuine smile. Progress, I realized, didn't always look like happiness. The preliminary hearing date arrived faster than expected. Dad took the day off to drive us to the courthouse. Raven wore her nicest dress, the blue one she'd gotten for last year's winter formal. I wore the outfit Mom had picked out, conservative, serious. We looked like strangers playing dress-up. Inside the courthouse, everything smelled like old paper and floor wax. We sat on hard wooden benches while lawyers talked in legal language I didn't understand. Vance was there in a suit instead of his uniform. He looked smaller, somehow older. He didn't look at us once. The hearing was shorter than I'd expected. The judge reviewed the charges, set another date, and that was it. We filed out past other families waiting their turn. In the parking lot, Dad's hand shook as he fumbled with the car keys. Raven took them gently and unlocked the doors for us. Back home, Mom had prepared a big dinner, but nobody was hungry. We picked at our food in silence until Raven suddenly started laughing. Not happy laughter, the kind that comes when you don't know what else to do. Soon we were all laughing, then crying, then both at once. Mom's carefully prepared meal sat forgotten as we held each other at the table. School became easier as time passed. The whispers stopped. My friends quit treating me like I might break. During lunch we talked about normal things, homework, movies which teachers were giving too much work. I started raising my hand in class again, started joining conversations instead of hiding. Dad's situation at work remained complicated. He'd been reassigned to a different precinct across town, adding 40 minutes to his commute. Some officers there welcomed him. Others kept their distance. He never complained, but I saw him rubbing his temples more often. Saw the tension in his jaw when he thought nobody was looking. One evening, 3 of Dad's old colleagues showed up at our door. Not the ones who'd supported him, different ones. They stood on our porch in their uniforms, faces hard. Dad stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Through the window I watched them talk. Or rather, they talked while Dad listened, his face like stone. After they left, Dad came back inside and went straight to his study. Mom followed. Raven and I pressed our ears to the door, but could only hear muffled voices. When they emerged an hour later, Dad announced he was taking early retirement. 20 years of service, ending not with a party, but with a quiet submission of paperwork. The news hit Raven hard. She blamed herself. Said if she just kept quiet, none of this would have happened. Dad pulled her close and told her firmly that speaking truth was never wrong, that he'd rather lose his job than lose his daughters, that some things mattered more than a badge. Mom started looking for work to help with finances. She'd been out of the workforce for years, but she updated her resume and started applying places. Dad took on consulting work, helping private security firms with training. It wasn't the same as being a cop, but it paid the bills. Celeste's mom filed for divorce. The paperwork was served while Vance was out on bail. Celeste told Raven that her mom seemed 10 years younger the day she signed those papers. They moved in with Celeste's grandmother permanently. A small house, but a safe one. The trial date kept getting pushed back. Legal maneuvering, our lawyer explained. Vance's attorney filing motions, requesting delays. Each postponement felt like another weight added to our shoulders. But our lawyer assured us this was normal, that justice moved slowly, but it did move. Raven turned 18 without fanfare. We'd already celebrated months ago when it mattered. Now it was just another day, though one that carried significance. She was legally an adult now. If Vance had gotten his way, she'd be in prison. Instead, she was free. Traumatized but free. Dad found a job with a private investigation firm. The pay was less, but the hours were better. He came home looking tired, but not defeated. Sometimes he'd share stories about insurance fraud cases or background checks. Boring stuff, he said, but honest work. I started having fewer nightmares. Whole weeks would pass without waking up gasping. Mom stopped checking on me multiple times each night. I even went back to shopping at the corner store, though I always went with friends now, never alone. One day at school, a younger girl approached me at lunch. She was in 5th grade, shy and nervous. She asked if she could talk to me privately. In the empty music room, she told me about her uncle who made her uncomfortable, who found excuses to be alone with her, who told her she was special. I walked her to the counselor's office and stayed while she repeated her story. The counselor's face grew grave as she listened. She thanked me for bringing the girl to her. Said I'd done exactly the right thing. As I left, I heard her picking up the phone, starting the process that might save another girl. Raven decided to delay college for a year. She wanted to be around for the trial. Wanted to see it through. She got a job at a local bookstore, surrounding herself with stories that ended better than ours had started. Sometimes I'd visit her during her shifts, and we'd reorganize shelves together in comfortable silence. Dad joined a support group for officers who'd left the force. He didn't talk about what happened in those meetings, but he came home steadier afterward. Mom said healing looked different for everyone. For Dad, it looked like accepting that his identity was more than a badge and gun. The final trial date was set for spring. Our lawyer prepared us for what to expect. The questions would be hard. The defense would try to discredit us, but she believed in our case, in our truth. She'd seen the evidence, heard the other girls' stories. Vance wouldn't walk away from this. 2 weeks before trial, Vance took a plea deal. 20 years, possibility of parole in 12. Our lawyer said it was a good outcome, that trials were traumatic and uncertain. This way he admitted guilt. This way it was over. But it didn't feel over. It felt like one chapter ending while the next remained unwritten. The day after the plea deal was announced, our family sat around the dinner table. The same table where Vance had threatened Raven, where we'd held our emergency family meeting, where we'd cried and laughed and slowly learned to be a family again. Now we sat there, changed but whole. Dad raised his water glass in a toast. To truth, he said. To courage, to second chances and new beginnings. We clinked glasses, the sound ringing clear in our kitchen. Outside, spring was arriving. Through the open window, I could hear birds singing. The world moving forward as it always did. That night, I helped Mom with dishes while Dad and Raven looked through college brochures. She decided to start in the fall after all. Life was moving forward. We were moving forward. Not unmarked by what had happened, but not defined by it either. As I headed to bed, I found another note from Raven on my pillow. This one just said, "Thank you for being you." I smiled and tucked it into my drawer with the first one. Some things were worth keeping. Some memories were worth preserving. The good ones that reminded us we'd survived. Wow. If you're still here after all that, thank you. Seriously, that was a tough one. And I don't take it lightly that you stayed to hear the whole story. These things are hard to tell, but even harder to live through. And if sharing them helps someone feel less alone, it's worth it. So until next time, be kind, be safe, and believe people when they tell you the truth. Like the video.